Emperor Jalketh stood before the vast crystalline windows of his palace throne room, gazing out at the sprawling capital city of New Varixia. The twin suns cast long purple shadows across the metallic spires that housed billions of beings from across the Galactic Coalition. His forearms were clasped behind his back, and his scaled skin reflected the dying light like polished emeralds. Behind him, the imperial court buzzed with nervous energy. Today was the day the emperor would choose his new personal guard, and every noble, advisor, and dignitary had their own candidate to promote. The position was more than ceremonial. Whoever stood at the emperor's side would have his ear, his trust, and considerable political influence. "Your Imperial Majesty," came the silk-smooth voice of Chancellor Vex Tan, his chief advisor. The tall, gray-skinned Zolothian approached with measured steps, his elongated skull gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. "The candidates have assembled in the Great Hall. Shall we begin the selection process?" Jalketh turned slowly, his golden eyes scanning the assembled court. Dozens of species were represented among his advisors. The warrior-like Coraxians with their chitinous armor, the telepathic Mindari with their oversized craniums, the aquatic depths dwellers in their mobility suits, and countless others. Each faction had spent months preparing their chosen representative for this moment. "Tell me, Chancellor," the Emperor said, his voice carrying easily across the vast chamber, "what makes a worthy guard?" Vex Tan straightened, clearly having prepared for this question. Strength, loyalty, skill in combat, knowledge of security protocols, and an understanding of the complex political landscape of the coalition. The candidate must be beyond reproach and yet, Jalketh interrupted, my predecessor was assassinated despite having guards who possessed all these qualities. An uncomfortable silence fell over the court. Emperor Jaxwell had indeed been killed just 3 years prior, despite being surrounded by some of the finest warriors in known space. The assassination had shaken the very foundations of the coalition and led to Jalketh's rise to power. "The candidates await your inspection, Your Majesty," pressed Admiral Korthax, the massive Thraxian military commander. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "The finest warriors from 17 species have volunteered for the honor. Each has been vetted by our intelligence services." Jalketh nodded and began walking toward the Great Hall, his court following in a carefully orchestrated procession. The massive doors, carved from a single piece of Varixian crystal, slid open silently at their approach. The Great Hall was even more impressive than the throne room, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow high above. Arranged in perfect formation stood 37 beings, each representing the pinnacle of their species' martial prowess. There were Coraxian berserkers whose natural armor could deflect plasma bolts, Zolothian assassins who could phase through solid matter, Mindari who could predict an attacker's moves before they made them, and many others. Jalketh walked slowly down the line, examining each candidate with apparent interest. The court followed at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves about the merits of each warrior. The Coraxian representative, Thrakmol, stood 9 feet tall and radiated barely controlled violence. The Mindari candidate, Zendara, had eyes that seemed to glow with psychic energy. Each was formidable in their own right. At the end of the line stood a figure that caused murmurs of confusion to ripple through the court. It was smaller than most of the other candidates, standing perhaps 6 feet in height. Its skin was a pale pink color, with only a thin layer of hair covering its scalp. It wore simple combat gear that looked primitive compared to the advanced armor and weapons of the other candidates. It was a human. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Count Velthor, his voice rising above the whispers. The blue-skinned nobleman's 4 eyes glowed with indignation. "Humans are barely past their industrial age. They've only been in space for what, 200 of their years? This is an insult." Chancellor Vex Tan stepped forward, consulting his datapad. Your Majesty, there seems to have been some sort of clerical error. This human... He checked his notes. Marcus Chen is listed as a candidate, but surely... There has been no error, Jalketh said quietly, but his words carried across the hall with absolute authority. I specifically requested that a human be included among the candidates. The court erupted in shocked whispers and barely contained protests. Humans were known throughout the galaxy as a young, aggressive species that had only recently joined the coalition. They were seen as barbaric, emotionally unstable, and technologically inferior. The idea that one might guard the Emperor was almost unthinkable. But Your Majesty, protested General Quintar of the Hegemony Defense Force, humans have no special abilities. They cannot phase through matter like the Zolothians. They lack the natural armor of the Coraxians. They have no telepathic abilities like the Mindari. They are soft, weak, and utterly ordinary. Jalketh approached the human candidate, who stood at perfect attention, eyes forward, showing no reaction to the insults being hurled at his species. The Emperor studied him for a long moment. "What is your assessment of the threats in this room?" Jalketh asked suddenly. Without hesitation, the human, Marcus, spoke in clear, unaccented galactic standard. 17 potential immediate threats, Your Majesty. The Coraxian in position 7 has a concealed blade in his left gauntlet. The Mindari candidate is attempting to probe your thoughts. Admiral Korthax has positioned himself for a clear shot at your position. Count Velthor's ceremonial staff contains an energy weapon. There are 6 automated defense turrets hidden in the ceiling that could be compromised, and the crystal windows are a weak point for long-range attacks. The court fell dead silent. Several of the mentioned individuals shifted uncomfortably, particularly those whose hidden weapons had been identified. Interesting, Jalketh mused. And what is your recommendation? Move to position Alpha 7, near the eastern pillar. It provides cover from multiple angles and clear sight lines to all potential threats. Also, respectfully, Your Majesty should not stand so close to windows during formal gatherings. Jalketh's scaled lips curved into what might have been a smile. And you noticed all of this while standing at attention for 20 minutes? Standard operating procedure, Your Majesty. Environmental awareness is basic survival training where I come from. The Emperor turned to face his court, his golden eyes sweeping across the assembled nobles and advisors. Many of them looked pale, realizing that their hidden weapons and defensive positions had been catalogued by this supposedly primitive being. I have made my decision, Jalketh announced, his voice echoing through the great hall. Marcus Chen of Earth will serve as my personal guard. The explosion of protest was immediate and deafening. Nobles shouted over each other. Military officers demanded explanations, and several alien dignitaries threatened to walk out entirely. Through it all, Jalketh remained calm, and Marcus remained motionless at attention. Chancellor Vexitan raised his voice above the chaos. Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. The political ramifications alone are mine to consider. Jalketh cut him off. The decision is final. As the court continued to rage and protest, the Emperor walked past them all toward the exit, with Marcus Chen falling into step exactly 2 paces behind him. The human's eyes constantly moved, scanning for threats, cataloging positions, and evaluating every being they passed. For the first time in years, Emperor Jalketh felt truly safe. 3 weeks had passed since the Emperor's controversial decision, and the Imperial Court remained in a state of barely controlled outrage. Marcus Chen had seamlessly integrated into the palace routine, but his presence was a constant reminder to the alien nobility of what they saw as a grave insult to their species and their traditions. Emperor Jalketh sat in his private study, reviewing intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The room was smaller than his formal offices, lined with ancient texts and artifacts from dozens of civilizations. Marcus stood silently by the door, his eyes constantly moving between the windows, the entrance, and the various access points. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Vextan entered with his usual formal bearing, though his tone carried an edge it hadn't possessed before. "The Council of Species Representatives has requested another audience regarding your security arrangements." Jalketh didn't look up from his reports. "Denied. We've had this discussion. With respect, Your Majesty, they're threatening to withdraw their support for the trade expansion bill. Count Velthor specifically mentioned that his people consider your choice of guard to be a sign of diminished mental capacity." Marcus shifted slightly, the first movement he'd made in over an hour. It was barely perceptible, but Jalketh caught it. "Something troubling you, Marcus?" the Emperor asked. "Permission to speak freely, Your Majesty?" "Always." Marcus kept his eyes on the door, but spoke clearly. "Count Velthor's delegation has increased their security detail by 40% in the past week. His trade advisors include 3 former military intelligence officers and a demolitions expert. That doesn't suggest someone concerned about trade policy." Vexatan's gray skin darkened with irritation. "Your Majesty, surely you don't believe a human's paranoid fantasies over—" He was interrupted by a soft chiming from the communication console. Jalketh activated the holographic display, revealing the concerned face of Security Chief Ralvin. "Your Majesty, we've detected unusual energy readings from the diplomatic quarters. The Velthorian delegation appears to be—" The transmission cut off abruptly. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the palace, bathing everything in red. The distant sound of energy weapons discharge echoed through the corridors. "Lockdown protocols activated," announced the palace's artificial intelligence. "All personnel report to designated secure areas immediately." Marcus was moving before the announcement finished. In one fluid motion, he drew a sidearm that none of the aliens had noticed he was carrying and positioned himself between the Emperor and the study's windows. "Your Majesty, we need to move. Now." Jalketh rose from his desk, his scales shifting color with stress. "Chancellor, initiate—" Vextan was backing toward the door, his elongated fingers dancing over a small device. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. The coalition will be better served by new leadership." The device beeped softly. Throughout the palace, hidden charges began detonating in sequence, targeting the main support structures. The building shuddered and dust rained from the ceiling. Marcus fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot shattered Vexatan's device. The second punched through the Chancellor's chest. The Zolothian collapsed with a look of genuine surprise on his alien features. "Emergency exit through the bookshelf," Marcus said, already moving to activate the hidden passage that even most of the court didn't know existed. "Your Majesty, stay directly behind me." "How did you—" Jalketh began. "I've memorized every floor plan, every escape route, and every security protocol in this palace. It's what humans do. We prepare for everything." They moved through the narrow maintenance corridor as the palace continued to shake around them. Marcus led with practiced efficiency, his weapon ready, his movements economical and precise. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of battle growing louder. "The main security force?" Jalketh asked as they descended a service stairway. "Compromised or dead. The Caraxian guards were poisoned at their evening meal. I noticed the cook's staff was changed yesterday. The Mindari telepaths are being jammed by psionic scramblers. The automated defense systems were turned against us by Vextan's access codes." They reached a junction in the maintenance tunnels. Marcus held up a hand, pressing himself against the wall and listening intently. After a moment, he gestured for them to continue left. "How many?" Jalketh whispered. "6 coming from the right corridor. They're trying to cut off our escape route." Marcus paused at another intersection, then smiled grimly. "But they made a mistake." "What mistake?" "They're thinking like aliens." Marcus pulled a small device from his belt and attached it to the wall. "Humans don't just plan escape routes, we plan ambushes." The device began beeping softly. Marcus led them down the left corridor at a faster pace, counting quietly under his breath. When he reached 0, the device exploded, bringing down a section of the tunnel behind them and blocking pursuit. "The spaceport," Marcus said, checking his sidearms charge. "There's a fast courier ship in Bay 7. I've had it fueled and ready since my second day." They emerged from the maintenance tunnels into the palace's lower levels. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the capital city in chaos. Buildings were burning, and aircraft filled with armed troops were converging on the palace. "This was coordinated," Jalketh observed, his golden eyes hard with anger. "Multiple species working together." "Yes, Your Majesty. They couldn't risk you discovering their plot, so they decided to act before their infiltration was complete." Marcus led them through a cargo bay toward the vehicle tunnels. But they made another mistake. Which was? They assumed a human guard would be like their warriors, specialists with narrow training. Marcus activated a ground transport with security codes he shouldn't have possessed. Human military doctrine is different. We cross-train. Every human soldier learns basic engineering, medicine, piloting, demolitions, and intelligence gathering. The transport moved swiftly through the underground tunnels toward the spaceport. Above them, the battle for the palace raged. But Marcus navigated through service routes that avoided the main conflict zones. "You knew this was coming," Jalketh realized. "I suspected it from day one. Your predecessor's assassination was too clean, too coordinated. Someone with high-level access planned it, and they were still here in the court." Marcus took a sharp turn as energy blasts lit up the tunnel behind them. The question wasn't if they'd try again, but when. They burst from the underground tunnels into the spaceport's cargo area. The facility was in pandemonium, with ships launching rapidly as their crews tried to escape the violence. Security forces loyal to various factions were fighting pitched battles across the landing pads. Marcus drove directly toward Base 7, weaving between crashed vehicles and debris. As they approached their destination, a group of armed Coraxians stepped into their path, weapons raised. Marcus didn't slow down. Instead, he pulled another device from his belt and threw it toward the aliens. It exploded in a brilliant flash of light and sound, disorienting the attackers just long enough for the transport to ram through their formation. "Stun grenade," Marcus explained as they skidded to a halt beside a sleek courier ship. "Humans call it shock and awe." They ran toward the ship as enemy fire erupted around them. Marcus returned fire with mechanical precision, each shot finding its target. By the time they reached the ship's ramp, 5 attackers lay motionless on the ground. As the ship lifted off, Jalketh watched his palace burning in the distance. The coup appeared to be succeeding, at least for now. "Where are we going?" he asked. Marcus was already plotting a course, his hands moving efficiently over the controls. "Somewhere safe, Your Majesty. Somewhere we can plan our counterattack." The ship jumped to hyperspace, leaving the chaos of New Verixia behind. For the second time in a month, Emperor Jalketh felt truly safe. And he was beginning to understand exactly why humans made such exceptional guards. The hidden fortress of Kethvaran had not been used in over 3 centuries. Built into the hollowed core of a dead moon orbiting a gas giant in an unmarked system, it had served as the imperial family's ultimate refuge during the ancient wars. Now, 2 months after the coup, it buzzed with activity once again. Emperor Jalketh stood before a massive holographic display showing the current state of his empire. Red zones marked systems controlled by the rebellion, blue showed areas still loyal to him, and gray indicated contested territories. The rebels held most of the core worlds, but their control was far from absolute. "Your Majesty," Admiral Korthax approached, his massive Thraxian frame moving with surprising stealth. Unlike many of the court nobles, the old soldier had remained loyal and had escaped the initial purge. The reconnaissance reports are complete. The rebels are consolidating power, but they're making the same mistake most conquerors make. Which is, Jalketh asked. They're thinking like politicians instead of soldiers, Marcus answered from where he stood near the tactical display. Over the past weeks, his role had evolved far beyond that of a simple bodyguard. They're dividing up territory and arguing over spoils instead of securing their position. Admiral Korthax nodded grimly. The human speaks truth. Count Velthor controls the capital, but Chancellor Vexitan's replacement is fighting him for primary authority. The Coraxians want military dominance, the Mindari want psychic surveillance networks, and the other species are all pursuing their own agendas. Meanwhile, Marcus continued, manipulating the display to show troop movements. They've left their flanks exposed. They're so focused on controlling the center that they've ignored the periphery. Jalketh studied the tactical situation. What do you recommend? Marcus highlighted several systems on the outer rim. We start here. Quick strikes against their supply lines and communication hubs. We don't try to hold territory, we just disrupt their ability to coordinate. Guerrilla warfare, Admiral Korthax mused. An interesting strategy, but we lack the numbers. We don't need numbers, Marcus interrupted, then quickly added, with respect, Admiral. Humans learned long ago that a small mobile force can defeat a larger static one if they use the right tactics. Over the next several hours, Marcus outlined a campaign that seemed impossible to the assembled military officers. Rather than attempting to reclaim territory through direct assault, he proposed a series of surgical strikes designed to fragment the rebellion and turn its various factions against each other. This is madness, protested General Quintar, one of the few high-ranking officers who had escaped the purge. We would be abandoning centuries of military doctrine. Your military doctrine, Marcus replied calmly, assumes your enemies think like you do. But humans developed different strategies because we had to. Our home world was divided among hundreds of competing groups for thousands of years. We learned to fight smarter, not just harder. Jalketh raised a scaled hand for silence. Explain this concept further. Marcus activated a historical display showing maps of Earth from various time periods. Every other species in the galaxy evolved on worlds where they eventually achieved unity through strength or telepathic coordination or natural harmony. Humans are different. We come from a world where cooperation was temporary and conflict was constant. He highlighted various regions and time periods. Romans fighting Celts, Chinese dynasties battling nomadic tribes, European powers competing for colonies. Humans spent millennia developing ways to defeat enemies who were often larger, better equipped, or more numerous than themselves. This makes humans seem like warmongers, Admiral Korthax observed. Not warmongers, Marcus corrected. Survivors. Every other species learned to think in terms of overwhelming force or natural advantages. Humans learned to think in terms of exploiting weaknesses and turning enemy strengths against them. The next few weeks proved Marcus's theories correct. The small loyalist fleet, using hit-and-run tactics, began systematically dismantling the rebellion's infrastructure. They struck supply convoys, destroyed communication relays, and eliminated key leaders before disappearing back into space. More importantly, they began feeding carefully crafted intelligence to different rebel factions, convincing each group that the others were planning betrayal. The Coraxians became convinced that the Mindari were plotting to enslave them psychically. The aquatic depths dwellers believed the terrestrial species were planning to poison their water supplies. Ancient prejudices and species rivalries, temporarily set aside for the coup, began reasserting themselves. It's working better than I expected, Jalketh admitted, as they watched reports of fighting between rebel factions. But how did you know they would turn on each other so quickly? Marcus was monitoring multiple communication channels, tracking the chaos they had helped create. Because that's what happens when cooperation is based on convenience instead of trust. Every species in the coalition joined together because it benefited them, not because they genuinely understood or liked each other. And humans? Humans learned to build genuine alliances because we had to. When your neighbor might be your enemy tomorrow, you develop very sophisticated ways of reading intentions, building trust, and creating lasting bonds. Marcus paused his monitoring to look at the Emperor directly. That's why you chose me, isn't it? Not because humans are the strongest or the smartest, but because we're the most adaptable. Jalketh's scales shifted to a deep amber color, the equivalent of a human smile. Partially correct. Tell me, why do you think I really selected you? Marcus considered this for a moment. Because every other species sees what they expect to see. They look at threats that match their own nature. A Caraxian looks for physical attacks, a Mindari looks for psychic intrusion, a Zelothian looks for stealth and assassination. And humans? Humans look for everything. We expect the unexpected because on Earth, survival meant being paranoid about every possible threat. Marcus gestured to the tactical display showing their recent victories. We don't just prepare for the obvious dangers. We prepare for the dangers we haven't even thought of yet. 3 months later, Emperor Jalketh stood once again in his throne room on New Varixia. The rebellion had collapsed not through military defeat, but through internal dissolution. The various species had turned on each other so completely that restoring imperial control had become almost trivial. Marcus stood at his customary position, 2 paces behind and to the right of the throne. The imperial court had been reconstituted, but with significant changes. The new advisors were chosen not just for their political connections, but for their loyalty and competence. Several were humans. Count Velthor and the other coup leaders were dead, killed either in the fighting between rebel factions or in the final imperial assault on the capital. Chancellor Vextan's replacement was a surprisingly pragmatic Mindari who had actually opposed the rebellion from the beginning. Your Majesty, the new chancellor approached with a data pad. The final casualty reports from the restoration campaign. Jalketh reviewed the numbers and nodded approvingly. The entire counter-revolution had cost fewer lives than a single major battle would have under traditional military doctrine. After the formal court session ended and the throne room had emptied, Jalketh turned to Marcus. Tell me honestly, did you expect the rebellion to collapse so completely? Marcus considered his answer carefully. I expected it to fragment, Your Majesty, but not quite this dramatically. The rebels made one crucial error in their planning. Which was? They assumed that because they could work together to remove you, they could work together to replace you. But humans learned long ago that destruction is easier than creation. Anyone can tear down a government. Building one requires trust, compromise, and genuine cooperation. Jalketh walked to the great windows overlooking his rebuilt capital. And that's why humans make superior guards, not because you're stronger or faster or more numerous, but because you understand the nature of loyalty itself. Yes, Your Majesty. Every other species evolved with natural hierarchies or telepathic connections or instinctive cooperation. They take loyalty for granted because it comes naturally to them. Humans had to learn to create loyalty artificially, which means we understand how fragile it can be and how to protect it. Outside the windows, the city sparkled under the twin suns, rebuilt and thriving. Ships from dozens of species moved through the sky, carrying goods and passengers in peaceful commerce. The Galactic Coalition was stronger than ever, unified not just by mutual benefit, but by a new understanding of what real security required. In the weeks that followed, requests began arriving from other member worlds. They wanted human advisors, human security specialists, and human guards. The species that had once dismissed humanity as primitive and unremarkable now competed fiercely to hire human experts. Emperor Jalketh approved these requests selectively, understanding that humanity's greatest strength, their ability to adapt and survive in any environment, made them valuable allies but potentially dangerous enemies. Better to have them as partners in building a stronger galaxy than to risk them becoming adversaries in tearing it apart. Marcus Chen continued to serve as the Emperor's personal guard, but his duties had expanded far beyond simple protection. He had become a teacher, showing alien security forces how to think like humans, how to see dangers they had never imagined and prepare for threats they couldn't even conceive of. The court gradually stopped referring to the Emperor's choice as madness or insult. Instead, they began calling it wisdom. After all, in a galaxy full of species that had evolved to be specialists, sometimes what you really needed was someone who had evolved to be a survivor. And in a universe where the only constant was change, survival was the most valuable skill of all.